Today we're going to talk about Parshat Parah. This is the Torah reading, the special, additional Torah reading of this coming Shabbat. And the origin of this, like the other Torah readings that we've already talked about in the series, are found in Masechet Megillah in page 29. And this is how the Mishnah reads on the bottom of side A in the 4th chapter called Bnei Ha'ir. We talked about the idea of Parshat Shkolim and the reasons behind that. We talked about B'Shenit on the second week, Zachor. B'Shlishit on the third, Parah Aduma, says the Mishnah. On the third, we read about the red heifer. Rashi says, Parah Aduma. Why are we reading about a red heifer? Lahazir es Yisrael. This is to exhort the Jewish people, Letaher, so they should purify themselves, Sheyasu Pischehem B'Tahara, that they should do their Korban Pesach in a state of ritual purity. The Gemara goes on, the Mishnah goes on to speak about then the fourth Parsha, which is called HaChodesh, and the Mishnah comments for a moment on the idea of interruptions and not. Rashi asks a question, and this question is lifted from the Talmud Yerushalmi, and the question is, Ma Hegdima, why is it that the Parah comes before the Chodesh, when in fact, as we're going to hear soon, the Parah was only made after the new moon was already established? And Rashi says, Shehi Taharasan Shal Yisrael, because it represents the purity of the Jewish people. So, simply stated, bringing a Parah, a Korban Pesach, is one of the most important mitzvahs that we have in our Torah. A person who doesn't bring a Korban Pesach is like a person who doesn't have a Brit Milah. Usually, kores, which is the most severe kind of punishment, it means a person will die prematurely and he gets cut off his source, can only come because of an infraction, a rebellion, of violating something Hashem said not to do, with two exceptions. The two exceptions are a person who purposefully and mindfully makes sure he doesn't get a bris milah, and the person who purposefully and mindfully rebels against Hashem and does not participate in the Korban Pesach. In order to bring a Korban Pesach, in order to bring the special offering in the Beis HaMikdash, one has to be in a state of ritual purity. Already the first time the Jewish people did this, in the year following the Exodus, there were people who missed out, and they came to Moshe and said, why do we miss out? We want to be part of this. And Moshe Rabbeinu speaks to Hashem, and they get something called Pesach Sheni, but that's not what we're going to talk about tonight. So far, so good. Very nice. So here we are, unfortunately, more than 1950 years after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, still waiting for the Beis HaMikdash to be rebuilt, and yet, in the week before Rosh Chodesh Nisan, we're going to be reminding ourselves that in the good, golden, olden days, when we had a Beis HaMikdash, we would have to be worried about making sure we're pure, and that requires a good 2 weeks in order to be ritually pure. You have to separate the 7 days, and there's a process of 7 days, and that's why you need to know about this before. So before Rosh Chodesh comes, everybody should have enough time to do it in advance, on time, we get the warning. All right. Most people would think, at best, this is some kind of Zecher LaMikdash, some kind of bringing to mind something that you once had to do. It's not even technically a mitzvah. There is no mitzvah to become pure per se. The mitzvah of Parah Aduma, as it's found in the book of mitzvahs of the Rambam, is that we were commanded to make a Parah Aduma. This is mitzvah Kuf Yod Gimel, mitzvah 113. In order, it should be muchenet l'mashat tzarech b'tara. So whoever will need to become ritually pure will be able to become ritually pure when they choose to, and they of course should elect to before Pesach, so they can bring the Korban Pesach. Okay, so it's business of remembering what our ancestors used to do, trying to relive the glory and the grandeur of yesteryear. One little problem, the facts. That's the only little problem. So I'm going to fast forward now from antiquity, from the Mishnah. I'm going to fast forward to closer to modern times, pre-modern times, and the Shulchan Aruch. And I want to share with you what the Mechaber, what the Beit Yosef says in the Shulchan Aruch. Chapter number Tafresh Pehei, which is 985 of the 685 of Orach Chaim. And in that chapter, in the 7th halacha, it says the following. Yesh Eimrim, there are those who say, Sheparshat Zachar, which we talked about, that the Parsha of remembering Amalek, Uparshas Para Aduma, and the Parsha of the red heifer, Chayovim Likaram Midiraisa. We have a biblical responsibility to read these Parshiot. A biblical responsibility. Lefichach, therefore, rules the Shulchan Aruch, Bnei HaYeshuvim, those who live in small settlements where there might not be a minyan, they have to do whatever it takes and make sure that for those Shabbatot, that they get themselves into a town that has a minyan and a shul, so that they can listen, Lishmoa Parshiot Elu, to listen to the reading of these Parshiot, Shehein Midoiraisa, because they are biblical. Biblical. The Ramah, in his glosses, does not dispute the words of the Mechaber. He doesn't say, well, that's not really biblical. No. He says, Ve'imi Afsher, but what if you can make it to town? So then, he says, at least, Yizharu L'kroisam B'niginosam B'vatamam, then at least read them with a proper cantillation, privately. Do something. At least open a Sefer Torah, at least read it as best you could. So the Magen Avram comes along, and he says, wow, Parshas Para and Parshas Zachar are both biblical? He says, if you look in the Shalah, you'll see that the Shalah brings numerous proofs to suggest that Parshas Para eina deraisa, that the Parsha of Para is not something biblical. And this dispute goes back into the work that precedes the Shulchan Aruch. In the Baal HaTurim, Rabbi Yaakov Baal HaTurim, who writes the forerunner of the modern-day Shulchan Aruch, the same system, the same chapters, he mentions nothing about it being biblical or not. He just simply says, as a same chapter, it's called Seder Parshias. This is the order of the Parshias, starting with Rosh Chodesh Adar, as we talked about in our class before Parshas Shkolim. We described this idea of a month of getting ready for Pesach and the season of liberation. But the Bet Yosef, before he wrote the Shulchan Aruch, he wrote a commentary on the Torah. And the Bet Yosef says, you look in the Gemara, you'll find reasons for these four Parshiot and these Shabbatot. And he says, V'kosvu b'Tosfos de Rabbeinu Peretz, which is one version of Tosfos, that Yesh Parshios HaMechuyavim Likrois D'Oraisa. Of these four, there are some that are biblically ordained. Kimo, for example, Parshat Zachor or Parshat Para Aduma, the Parsha of remembrance, and the Parsha of the red heifer. Now, the Parsha of remembrance, it says it's a mitzvah to remember, and it says write it in a book, Ksov Zot B'Sefer. And we have it on good authority that even before the first Sifrei Torah were completed by Moshe Rabbeinu on the day of his passing, that the Jewish people had to write down the story of Amalek in those first 38 years, and they had to read the story from a book once a year, because it says Ksov Zot B'Sefer. Moshe Rabbeinu instructed the Jewish people to write down this narrative, this episode, in a book, and then they had a mitzvah to remember. So there's a mitzvah of reading, a mitzvah of verbalizing, and a mitzvah of remembering, as we discussed in our class a few weeks ago. And therefore, that's Min HaTorah. It says it in the Torah. It says, Ksov Zot B'Sefer. Write this in a book. It says you must remember this. It's one of the things we're obligated to remember. We explained in our class that when a person reads from a Torah once a year, that gives him the ability to remember a whole year long. But how is there a mitzvah Min HaTorah to read about a red heifer? There isn't even a mitzvah to sprinkle the ashes of the red heifer. How could this be biblical? But the Beit Yosef says it is. The Bach, who is the other commentary, the Bayit Chadash, he wrote another commentary in the Torah. It was a Bet Yosef, the house of Yosef. He wrote Bayit Chadash. Rabbi El Sirkis wrote a new house. And he says, I saw what Bet Yosef writes. I see he says that Parshas Para, Aduma, is also biblical. He says, V'tzarech iyon. I don't know what to make of this. This needs to be analyzed. This needs to be looked into. Milah lahu ha. Where did he get that from? Where did he get that from? Where's the source? B'ishleim Parsha Zachar. When you come and tell me the Parsha of remembering about Amalek, Vadai, for sure. Mashma and Perek Beis, the Megillah, the Havadei Raisa, the Gemara seems to be intimating very clearly that it's biblical. It says in the Torah, Ksov Zot Zikorum b'sefer. Write it down, and that'll be a memory, and it's in a book. Okay, so you have to read it once a year. Parshas Parah? Where does it say such a thing? And so, the Magen Avram, in his commentary, Shulchan Aruch says, and the Bach says, where does it come from? And he quotes the Tosfos HaKetzaros. He takes us to a Tosfos, and this is a Tosfos I shared with you in our class, Parsha Zachar, and this is a Tosfos that's found in Maseches Megillah. And over there, the Tosfos has a question, because Rashi seems to indicate that it would be a mitzvah to read from a Torah. So what does that mean? How could it be a mitzvah to read from a Torah? So the Tosfos says, Kriyas HaTorah, reading from the Torah, Eina min HaTorah, is not from the Torah, element of Rabbanan, it's a rabbinic origin. Levad, with one exception. And that exception is Parshat Zachor. Doesn't say Levad, Parshat Zachor, and Parshat Parah. He says, that's it. So the Tosfos HaKetzaros, as he calls it, the short version of Tosfos, which is the Tosfos that's printed in Masechet Megillah on page 13b, in the top of page 13b, says clearly that there is only one and only one biblical Torah reading, and that's Parshat Zachor. And then he says, in the Sefer Mitzvahs Katan, it also says that it's a biblical mitzvah to hear the Torah reading of Zachor, but it's not a mitzvah to hear Parah. And he says, as far as Parshas Parah, Sevira Lahu Delehavah Deraisa, he believed it was not biblical. The Be'emet, here's the words of the Magen Avram, Be'emet, Ein Tam Bekriyata Midiraisa. There has no rhyme and reason to it being biblical. V'gam lo yadaina heicher miza. I have no idea, he says, where they even got this from. I have no idea where the origin of this is. The Shulchan Aruch says it. The Beit Yosef says, I don't know where this is coming from. Well, it's coming from some pretty solid sources. That's the truth. And now I'm going to show you the other sources. So the other sources are no less than the Tosfos himself. But the Tosfos was compiled with many Bali HaTosfot. And it starts off with the Tosfot in the Sechet Brachot, which I did quote in our previous class, where we have this question on what Rashi says. And the Tosfos says, you know when it could be that you're obligated to read the Torah? The mighty parshiot, plural, parshiot, portions, hamechuyavim, likros midiraisa, which are obligated to read biblically, come for example, Parshat Zachor. So the Tosfos doesn't actually say Parshas Parah, but it says parshiot. It indicates that there is more than one parsha, which is min HaTorah. Which would it be? So in our Tosfos, it doesn't say it. However, there is a version of Tosfos called Tosfos HaRosh. And in the Tosfos HaRosh, it says very clearly, it's the same Tosfos on the same page of Masechet Megillah, Brachos on page 13. And over there, the Tosfos says, Yesh kriya shohi min HaTorah. There is a kriya which is min HaTorah. Kigon, for example, Parshat Zachor, Parshat Parah Aduma, V'chayotze bahem, and others like it, which is even more intriguing. Others like it? We're trying to wrap our heads around the fact that Parshas Parah Aduma should be biblical, and the Tosfos HaRosh is saying others like it. The Tosfos HaRosh is not alone. Listen to this. Straight out of Chidushei HaRashba. Rabbi Shlomo ben Avraham ben Aderet, one of the great Rishonim, on the same place in Tosfos, he also stops in this and he says, what's going on here? Rashi writes that it's a mitzvah to read from the Torah, and everybody asks a question, where do we find such a thing? We don't find anywhere that there is reading of the Torah which is biblical. What was Rashi thinking? And the Rashba says, Yoimer Rashi Zal, Rashi will tell you that there would be Torah readings that are biblical. Now, the Rashba doesn't say this is his opinion, but he says even worse, he says it's Rashi's opinion. That's even more than the Rashba's opinion. He says, what would Rashi tell you? He would say, Kigem Parshas Parah u Parshas Zachor. Here he first writes Parshas Parah, and only afterwards writes Parshas Zachor. And then he also says, Uchayotze bahen. So now we have a second compelling source. We have the Bet Yosef quoting Tosfos to Rabbeinu Peretz, which I didn't find. But we have a Tosfos that alludes to more than one reading, a Tosfos HaRosh that clearly says Parshas Parah is biblical, and a Rashba. These are the great Rishonim, my friends, who says that it's biblical. And a Ritva, another great Rishon, Rabbeinu Yom Tov Al-Ghazi. And he says like this. He says, Yesh lanu kriyot b'chiyuv min haTorah. We have, he says, readings that are biblical. For example, Kigon Parshat Zachor. B'chein, and similarly, Parshas Parah. Now the Ritva comes along and alleviates our other question. We were puzzled. What's the other ones? Uchayotza behen. He says, I'll tell you. For example, Hakel. It's a biblical mitzvah to gather the Jewish people together every 7 years on the morrow of the Shemitah year, gathering all the Jewish people together on the threshold of the year that's passed, and the Melech Yisrael, the king or the leader of the Jewish people, has to read from the Torah. That's a biblical mitzvah. And he says there's another biblical mitzvah. The other biblical mitzvah could be Mikra Bikurim. When you come before Hashem and you bring the fruits, the firstling fruits, you also have a reading to do. So that reading would be biblical. And when you read verses, you're supposed to read it from the Torah. Chalitza. When we have a situation where there's a marriage and that wasn't kind of fully severed because the husband died, but he left no children, so now she's kind of stuck to the brothers and they have to sever her and set her free. It's called chalitza. Vidui Meiser. Every 3 years, you have to say, I emptied out all the tithes. So here, the Ritva talks about a number of biblical readings, and he says all of these are talked about in Masechet Sota, and so he says that's the meaning of biblical readings. So now, we understand the meaning of other biblical readings, but I brought you 4 sources in Rishonim, solid sources, who say, clearly, that Parshas Parah is Min HaTorah. And the Rashba going so far as to say, that is the opinion of Rashi. That must be the opinion of Rashi. Which really the other ones are kind of saying also. So what does this mean? What does it mean then to say that Parshas Parah is Min HaTorah? And here we have these very, very solid questions like, okay, where's the source for that? Clearly the Rishonim knew something. They had some kind of tradition from somewhere, but we don't know what that is. Or we don't know why in heaven we should be reading about the ashes of Parah Aduma. I understand you have to make an announcement. If you want to tell me that was a biblical idea, a rabbinic idea, that the rabbi said, your job is to make sure every single member of Am Yisrael will participate in the Korban Pesach. How are we going to get the message out? We're going to post it on Facebook. No, that didn't work 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago. How are you going to get the message out? I know, we're going to put up big billboards. There were no billboards. You're going to send a telegraph. No telegraph yet. How are you going to get the message out? Word of mouth. What's the most effective word of mouth? You do it in shul. What's the best way to get the word out in shul? Read from a Torah. Okay, that's a very nice rabbinic idea. That's like Parsha Shkolim. Parsha Shkolim was also ordained by the rabbis. That makes perfect sense. Don't get me wrong. It makes perfect sense that we should be reading about Parshas Parah, as Rashi told us. The reason is that the Yisrael, the Jewish people, have to make themselves pure. Sheyasu pischeim b'tara. Rashi explains it very clearly in Masechet Megillah on page 29. This is why. I am not asking why we read this parsha. I know why we read this parsha. I'm asking you the question, what does it mean that it's biblical? How could it be biblical? Why would it be biblical? What's the source of such a thing? But major Rishonim are saying this. Now we have, for example, the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher. Rabbeinu Asher, in the 7th chapter of Masechet Brachot, where he speaks about a person who freed an indentured laborer in order to have a minyan. And the question was, but that's not permitted, then why would he do that? And the answer, he said, was that the Mairi b'deraisa kigon likras Parsha Zachor, to read Parsha Zachor shu min HaTorah. But the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, in his halachas, does not say Parshas Parah. Very interestingly, in the Divrei Chamudos, which is an important commentary written on the Rosh, he says, Parsha Zachor, we extrapolate that from the Torah directly, and he says it's got to be written in that way. And he says, there are others who maintain and read a different version here. And they say it's talking about Parsha Zachor and Parshas Parah Aduma. And the Divrei Chamudos says, I do not know. Where in heaven did they find this? Where did they find Parshas Parah Aduma mechuyavim likroisa min haderaisa? You're obligated to read it biblically. Where do you find it? V'gam lo yadaiti. I don't know the ka'omer lasuyu mai. I don't know where he got this from. I don't know what the purpose of it would be. I don't know. So we had many great rabbis who were baffled by this. But as I demonstrated to you, clearly there's Rishonim who say this. And perhaps most compellingly, the Shulchan Aruch paskins like that. And the Ramah doesn't argue. Only the Magen Avram was a commentary. Now the Alter Rebbe in his Shulchan Aruch, just FYI, the Alter Rebbe pretty sure would agree with the Magen Avram, because he talks about in the laws of Shabbos, in chapter 282 of the laws of Orach Chaim, which are laws that speak about the reading of the Parsha and the Haftorah. So he says over here that you can always call a child to mafter if he understands who he's making a bracha to. Even though a Parsha Zohar is biblically obligated, that everybody should hear it, and the katan, the child, is not going to be able to help them fulfill their obligation, nonetheless, he can still make the blessings. You can read it maybe, you can still make the blessings. So the Alter Rebbe is very clear. The Alter Rebbe doesn't say Parsha Zohar u Parsha Parah. He says Parsha Zohar. Okay, fine. We'll say the Alter Rebbe rules like the Magen Avram, and the Magen Avram is ruling like the Bach. But it's very interesting that the Shulchan Aruch, Machaber, and Ramah both say this is biblical. What's going on over here? I spoke today to a very, very well-known erudite rabbi. Between me and you, he hacked me in China for 45 minutes, and he did not give me an answer. This idea, that makes sense to me. Give me a clear answer. How and why would this be biblical? Okay, we have a challenge. We have a challenge in our hands. Just to make the soup a little thicker, I'm going to share with you that the Trumas Hadeshen, who is an origin, a major book of responsa, very early book of responsa, he brings both opinions. He says, in Tosfos Shantz, which is a very accurate form of Tosfos, he says, Ein shum kriya midiraisa rak Parsha Zachar. But he says, but in Tosfos HaKetzaros, in the shorter versions of Tosfos, which others say is our Tosfos, most of our Tosfos, it says over there, it says, Parsha Zachar u Parshas Parah. So our version of Tosfos says Parshiyot, but doesn't say Parah. In the Trumas Hadeshen's version of Tosfos, it did say Parshas Parah. Major Rishonim here. Tosfos de Rabbeinu Peretz, Tosfos Arosh, Rashba, Ritva, Trumas Hadeshen, according to Tosfos HaKetzaros, at least 5 major Rishonim who are telling you that it's biblical. How do you figure this? So amazingly, I was not able to find an answer in any of the Rishonim. In fact, I would like to suggest to you that the Jerusalem Talmud is of the opinion that it's not biblical. How could I be so sure? First of all, I'm not so sure. But I want to just share with you something I found in the Jerusalem Talmud. In the Talmud Yerushalmi, in the 3rd chapter of Masechet Megillah, in the 5th halacha, the Gemara says the following: Rabbi Levi b'shem Rabbi Chama bar Chanina. This is the Talmud Yerushalmi commenting on the same Mishnah I read to you from Masechet Megillah, page 29 of the Babylonian Talmud. So he says, B'dinhu, really, shetaktem ha'chodesh l'para. Parshat ha'chodesh should have been written before Parshat Parah. So why wasn't it? He says, that's because shebe'echad b'nisan hukum ha'mishkan, because on the first day, the Mishkan was established. That's this week's Parsha, Parsha Shmini, the first day of Nisan. When did they make the first Parah Aduma? Ubisheni nisrifa hapara. But the Parah Aduma was not burned until the second day. So the first day they built a Mishkan on Rosh Chodesh. On the second day, they made a Parah Aduma. So he says, V'lama Parah Kedemis. And why does the Parah Aduma come first? And he answers, Shehi mitaharasan shel kol Yisrael, because it's what makes all the Jewish people pure. And making the people pure, that comes first. So, interestingly, the Korban Ha'eda and the Pnei Moshe, which are the 2 major commentaries on the Jerusalem Talmud, kind of both ask the same question. Okay, why was that the case? Why was the Mishkan first put up, and why did they make the Parah Aduma second? If purity of the Jewish people is so important, why didn't God make a Parah Aduma first? And they give the same answer. He said, because a Parah Aduma has to be made before a Mishkan, before the presence of Hashem. So you first had to set up a Mishkan, and after you set up a Mishkan, then you can make a Parah Aduma. So there was no choice. But I'm thinking to myself, if the reading of Parah Aduma is biblical, and if the reading of HaChodesh is rabbinic, is this a question? Of course the biblical reading will go first. So maybe, I don't know, this is just my suggestion, I didn't clear this with anybody, maybe we could say that from the Jerusalem Talmud, it seems to indicate that it's not a biblical reading. Maybe. I don't know what certainly it would seem, because it would seem to me that if it would be a biblical reading, this question would be a moot question to begin with. But then again, Rashi quotes this Jerusalem Talmud, but we don't know for sure that Rashi would say that Parah is a biblical reading. It's only what the Rashba read into Rashi. We don't know. Rashi could say only Zachar is biblical. I mean, we don't know. So the only answer I was able to find, which is a technical answer, the only one, bar none, is something that comes from a commentary on the Chumash written by the last, one of the last great rabbis of the Eastern European city called Dvinsk. Dvinsk was a city that was blessed with two extraordinary rabbis. It's near Pinsk. You're saying that from first-hand knowledge? Okay. I'm not so sure it's so very close. You would know? Dvinsk is near Pinsk? Your father was from Dvinsk? Okay, that's it. So I don't know how famous the city was outside the Jewish world. Not so famous. But in the Jewish world, this city lucked out. It won the lottery. The last rabbis before the war were two of the greatest scholars of the time. The Hasidic rabbi was known as Rabbi Yosef Rosen, called the Rogatchover Gaon. The greatest Torah mind, bar none, of the 20th century. And he was the Hasidic Rav. The non-Hasidic Rav was a man whose name was Meir Simcha HaKohen. Was more well known by the name of his book Or Sameach. But he also wrote a commentary on Chumash. And the truth is, when it came to genius, he could not keep up with Rogatchover Gaon. But the Rogatchover Gaon was not a very articulate person, and he was not a gregarious person. He was a scholar. He was a scholar with a razor-sharp mind and a razor-sharp mannerism. And Meir Simcha was more affable, and more handsome, and he spoke more eloquently. A very big Talmud Chacham also. So he wrote a commentary on the Chumash. It's called Meshach Chachma. And this is the only place I found an answer, although, as you'll soon see, to me, it opens up even a bigger question. His answer is like this. He brings down the question of the Magen Avraham. He says, the Magen Avraham thunders. Where is this coming from? He says, I don't know what his problem is. You know where it's coming from? It's coming right from the Chumash. Because in the end of Parshat Tzav, Alan, do me a favor. There's a blue Chumash on the first table. It's under a gray Chumash. If you can find the blue Chumash under the gray Chumash, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. So he says, in the end of Parshat Tzav, which is found in the 8th chapter of Leviticus, in verse 34, the Torah says over there that La'asais. You found the Chumash? Yeah, the blue one. This will make life easier for me. I quote it straight from the Chumash. Thank you. The Torah says, when it finishes talking about the concept of the 7 days of inauguration, 7 days of Miluim, it says in verse 34, Ka'asher asa b'yom hazeh, as they did on this day, tziva Hashem lasos, Hashem commanded to do, l'chaper aleichem. Okay? Ka'asher tzi asa b'yom hazeh, as they did on this day, God had commanded to do, to atone for you. So Rashi says, in other words, as you did today what Hashem wants, what this means to wait for all 7 days. And then Rashi says, Rabbi Seinu Darshu, because this verse seems a little closed. It's not like a straightforward, easy read, this verse. He says, Lasos, the word Lasos, our rabbis tell us in the Gemara Masechet Yoma, to do, Ze Maisei Para, to do is the Para Aduma. L'chaper, to atone, Ze Maisei Yom Kippurim. This is the deeds, the things of Yom Kippur. And this teaches you that the Kohen Gadol has to be separated before Yom Kippur for 7 days, just like the Kohen who is going to make the Para Aduma. So the end of Parshat Tzav talks about 7 day separation, and then the big 8th day. And this is what had to happen every single year before Yom Kippur. The Kohen Gadol had to be set aside for 7 days. And this is what happened to the Kohen who would make the Parah Aduma. So the Meshech Chochmah says, did you realize what this pasuk says according to Gemara and Yoma? The Gemara is basically telling us that the making of a Parah Aduma and the act of Yom Kippur are almost one and the same. They're conjoined at the hip, Yom Kippur and Parah Aduma. Yom Kippur needs 7 days separation, and Parah Aduma needs 7 days of separation. Later on, in this very same tractate, a few pages later, the Gemara goes to great lengths to demonstrate that everything we said about these 7 days is not only applicable in these 7 days, but also goes forward in the future. And so, the Meshech Chochmah reasons, on Yom Kippur, we know it's a biblical concept that the Kohen Gadol is supposed to read from the Torah. The Kohen Gadol read from the Torah. That was one of the things he was supposed to do. It's a biblical thing. So he said, if the Kohen Gadol had to read from the Torah on Yom Kippur, then it makes sense that somebody had to read from the Torah before they made a Parah Aduma. Because they're compared to one another. Yom Kippur and Parah Aduma. And the Gemara says, in all aspects, they're likened to one another. So if they're likened to one another in all aspects, just as Yom Kippur warrants a Torah reading, so too, the Parah Aduma would warrant a Torah reading. So what's the problem with this answer? The problem with this answer, to me, and I'm just not wrapping my head around this, is that works for making a Parah Aduma. But the fact is, we didn't make a Parah Aduma on an annual basis. In fact, Rambam tells us that in history, there were only 9 Parot Adumot made. The first was made by Moshe Rabbeinu, and it lasted all the way until the beginning of the second Beit HaMikdash. From Moshe Rabbeinu. It lasted over 1,000 years. In the time of the second Beit HaMikdash, Ezra made the second Parah Aduma. From Ezra until the end of the Second Temple era, another 7 Parot Adumot were made. The Ha-series and the 10th and final Parah Aduma, Yaseh Melech HaMashiach, says the Rambam, this will be made by the anointed King Mashiach. Meheira Yigala, Amen Ken Yehiratzon. That's the words of the Rambam. May he speedily be revealed. Amen, may it be his will. That's the words of the Rambam. So basically, if you're telling me, if the Meshech Chochmah is telling me that the concept of Yom Kippur and the concept of Parah Aduma are joined at the hip, and what happens in one must happen in the other, and therefore, just like you need to be separating from the regular family life and regular comings and goings, and the Kohen Gadol have to move into a special apartment and be doing only holy things for 7 days before Yom Kippur. The same thing also applies to the concept of Parah Aduma. And he says, just like Yom Kippur needs a Torah reading, a Parah Aduma needs a Torah reading too. All right, I'm okay with that. So when you make a Parah Aduma, read from the Torah. Why are we reading from the Torah every year? And yet, the Rishonim are telling us that this is an annual biblical mandate, that we should read from the Torah every single year. So whilst the Meshech Chochmah's answer is very compelling, it's very interesting, very compelling, it does not, to me, seem to really answer in a satisfactory manner the fact that this is a biblical mitzvah on an annual basis. Which leads me to one conclusion, only one conclusion. There was some kind of tradition that this was a biblical idea. To it. It's not a clear proof, not a clear, compelling, direct proof, but there seemed to be some kind of connection between a Torah reading and between a Parah Aduma. And because the Parah Aduma was something that had to be performed Pesach, and missing the Korban Pesach is considered to be a grave violation of Hashem's Torah. So at least once a year, people had to make sure they were pure. And since Torah readings seem to be connected to the concept of Parah Aduma, so I suppose there was this tradition that many Rishonim had that Parah Aduma is actually biblical, even though it doesn't say it openly in the Torah. Which leads me then to the final question. Say we accept all this. Clearly the Rishonim must have a source. Magen Avram questions, maybe that source has been lost to us. Meshech Chochmah has a tantalizing suggestion. Maybe it helps us appreciate some kind of biblical link between the concept of Parah Aduma and Torah reading, for which we could kind of reconstruct this idea that the Parah Aduma's publicization should specifically happen through a Torah reading, and that was a biblical idea in and of itself. Let's accept all that. We have to at the end of the day, because it's Shulchan Aruch, it says it's a biblical mitzvah. Many Rishonim say it's a biblical mitzvah. Many say it's not. Many say it is. So clearly seems to be a very, very persistent tradition that it is. So it's got to have some kind of origin. And maybe the Meshech Chochmah is right, that's what it is. But I ask you a simple question. Why? Why, of all needs a Torah reading? Of all mitzvahs? Of all mitzvah, the mitzvah that's not even a mitzvah. As I mentioned to you before, the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs, his language is very clear. He says, Mitzvah 113, Atzivu Shenitztavinu La'ases Parah Aduma, the commandment God gave us to make a Parah Aduma. Ready? L'masha tzarech b'tara, for whatever you'll need to be pure. Whoever, whatever. And he says, it says it in the Pasuk. That's the words we're going to be reading in this biblical reading. It will be for the Jewish people as a safeguard. He said safeguard means you have to have it. The Rebbe spoke about this many times. And he said it's clear that the purpose of this mitzvah is not to purify, but rather the preparation of the ashes themselves. That's the mitzvah. And furthermore, it's not only a mitzvah to prepare the ashes, it's a mitzvah to be sure that these ashes are always ready. In other words, that the medium, the vehicle, the mechanism through which we can bring tahara always has to be at our fingertips. And the Rebbe goes on to talk about the spiritual message that this represents. He says, Tumas Meis, the ritual impurity that is symbolized by the impurity of coming in contact with the dead, symbolizes being totally cut off from God. Because it says, Va'atem advekim, you cleave unto God, chayim, then you're alive. And tzaddikim never stop being connected to Hashem. Even in their passing, they're called live, because they're always connected to Hashem. But he says death means to be disconnected. If you're connected to Hashem, that's life. Disconnected from Hashem is death. Why? Because Hashem is the source of all life. So real life means you have to be connected to Hashem. So what happens if a Jew is disconnected? I mean cut off, chas v'shalom. What do you do? So we have to always know it's our job to provide the way to come home. We got to keep the door open. We have to have that little jug of ashes. We have to be always ready to help the person who is ritually impure to the point of death to come back to life. That's the mitzvah. And that mitzvah is that in Avodah, the Rebbe says, means that we always have to be making sure that we provide pathways and doorways for our fellow Jews to come home. That's a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah that clearly is so important. It has to actually be read from a Torah. So, kind of to conclude today's lesson, or round it off, I'm going to share with you the contents of an amazing mimer that the Rebbe delivered on Parshat Parah in the equivalent of the year 1982. The Rebbe began with a question. He says, the Torah, when it introduces this mitzvah, it says, Zot chukat haTorah. This is the chok, this is the statute of the Torah. It doesn't say this is the statute of the parah. That's what it should have said. It's a statute of the parah, the statute of the heifer. This is the statute of the Torah. Why is it the statute of the whole Torah? And in this mimer, the Rebbe goes on to describe how the parah aduma is emblematic of Yiddishkeit itself. And its impact is a reflection of the saga or the narrative of everybody's life. He says, first of all, let's look at the parah aduma itself. In order to make the substance that can bring about ritual purity, what do you need to have? He says two opposites. You need to have the ashes, the remnants of fire, and you need to have water. And the water has to be from a live source, not a wadi, which temporarily floods and then dries out. It has to be what's called mayim chayim, a source of continuously generating water. The water has to be continuously bubbling up from beneath the ground, a real source of water. And he says, you're taking these two polar opposites and mixing them together. He says, fire represents the concept of yearning. When there's a fire, electrons are released. Whatever moisture in the subject, in the item is released. And the same is true also with whatever gas. It's all released into the air. What's left? Only the earth, the soil, the ashes. Everything else is released. The electrons are released. When the electrons collapse, the whole structure collapses, because everything has in it Eish, Ruach, Mayim, and Afar. Eish is fire or electrons. And Ruach is gas. Literally wind, but gas. And Mayim is liquidity or moisture. And then there's offer. So fire is what happens when the substance is left, but the style is gone. The soul is gone. The spirit is gone. The vitality is gone. You had something that was beautiful, sleek or supple, and it was wonderful. And now it's ashes, dried out, a burned out shell, nothing left. Why? Because that's the nature of fire. Fire is that the elements yearn to be set free. And which direction does fire travel? Up. But water falls down. You don't call it Niagara up, you call it Niagara Falls. The water's falling. And this represents the idea not of ratzui, or the spiritual fervor, the passion of trying to escape a situation, but instead shuv, bringing it all back home. Harnessing, channeling, water gets channeled. This is the two spiritual, so to speak, the yin and yang of spirituality. That on one hand, spirituality has ratzui, everything from the angelic worlds all the way down to our souls have these two experiences. On one hand, the person always wants to get away from the norm. You're looking for excitement, and you're looking for something different, and you want to go on vacation, and you want to run away. And then when people go away, what do they want? I just want to go home. Just want my comfort zone. And then they get bored of their comfort zone. They want to get out of their comfort zone and go do something crazy and get out. And they say, oh yeah, I can't. It's too much chaos for me. I need to go back. And that's what life's about. The neshama rages and it wants to be close to Hashem, and then it says, yeah, you know what? I think if I want to be close to Hashem, like I should just be a mensch. Just like follow a schedule and do the mitzvah I'm supposed to do. But I'm going to rage and I have a passion for but maybe I should just go back to basics. This is something, in spiritual terminology, is called Ratziv V'Shev, which characterizes life itself. And the Rebbe says it represents the idea of galut, of exilic dispersion, and the yearning to come back home. It represents the idea of a neshama that's distanced from its source, that's shackled in a body, stuck in a corporeal reality, that yearns to be set free, but at the same time, very much wants to be alive. As the Mishnah says, Al karcha chatachai, Al karcha chatames. No neshama ever wanted to come down and be part of life here. But once you're here, nobody wants to leave. Nobody normal, at least. Everybody wants to stay here. This is the conflict of life, if you will. This is the tension of life. And this is what the Paraduma represents. And the Paraduma's idea is that at all times, always, a person can always take everyday life and energize it with a fervor and a passion. And no matter where you may roam, you can always come home. No matter how far you travel, no matter how impure and disconnected a Jew might become, he can always return to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He can always return to God's embrace. That's the message of the Paraduma. And it seems to me, my dear friends, that it could even be a biblical mitzvah for us to hear these words and to internalize their message and to understand that the most important thing of Yiddishkeit is Jewish renewal. It's not about what happened, it's about what's going to be. Spring, Pesach, is all about renewal. Chodesh HaAviv. Chodesh HaAviv is when things begin to bloom, not only materially, spiritually. And how do we prepare for fresh life? By getting past all the impurity of before. By knowing that if we will only prepare ourselves, we will be ready for Pesach, ready to be born again, ready to become filled with light and fervor, with flowers and blossoms, that Yiddishkeit can always and will always be able to come back to life. And this is such a profound idea. And if you go through this mimer carefully, it's a beautiful mimer. The Rabbi describes it in so many ways, how the Parah Aduma becomes paradigmatic of nothing short of than Yiddishkeit in life itself. Perhaps this is the reason, it helps us understand why it's so important to have this, not only this idea should be part of our life, but that it actually should be read from the Torah. And as I shared with you in our class on Parshat Zachar, when a Torah scroll is read publicly, it serves as a conduit and an infusion of vitality and energy and power to each and every one of us. And so it's a mitzvah for us to get together and listen to the Torah be read. And when we hear the words of the Torah and internalize the words of the Torah, then the power of Chukas and the power of Parshas Parah becomes a defining hallmark in our life as Jewish people, enabling us to fulfill our destiny and hopefully, Eretz Hashem, to experience the V'zarakti Aleichem Mayim Tahirim, Hashem Himself purifying us with the coming of Mashiach B'mheira will be Ameinu Amen.